Welcome to Environmental Fridays. It is Personal, Season 3. This season we'll be featuring 12 episodes with 12 guest speakers from Barbados, Delaware, Grenada, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Washington, and Virginia. Now here's our host, Dr. Desmond Hartwell Murray. And this week's co-host, Rin. And this week's guest speaker, Dr. Morris C. Johnson.
Okay, so we want to start by welcoming everyone to our Environmental Fridays. This is episode 7, and we are in season 3 of Environmental Fridays. This morning, our topic revolves around forest fires, and they are, in fact, a global threat, and they are predicted to get worse over the next few years, decades. They are becoming bigger, hotter, and more destructive, and their impacts are, in fact, personal. So the question is, what can we do? How can we manage forest wildfires? That's the focus of this week's Environmental Fridays. I have a under 2-minute video here from the United Nations to emphasize the fact that this is a global issue.
I've got coordinates and size for spot number 2.
All right, so let's go back. Okay, so our Environmental Fridays website is www.theenvironmentalfridays.com. You could also take your camera and focus on our QR code, and that's another way of getting to the website, and you'll find more details there about the Environmental Fridays guest lecture series. One of the things we encourage you to do, whether you're online now looking at the episode, or if you look at it after we've uploaded it to YouTube, is to send us your reaction, your feedback, your suggestions, your thoughts, 100 words or less. Include your name and affiliation. Send it to me, Desmond Murray, murrayd@andrews.edu. Some of these will be published online. We already have some on our testimonials page. So, upcoming next week. Next week, we have another issue that's affecting human life and activities around the world. It began, I think, around 2011. That's sargassum. It's a weed. You could see it there in the picture, in the video. And it's just been an issue that has affected lots of different places, the Caribbean, small islands, off the coast of Brazil, and so on. And so this is our topic coming up for next week, and we'll hear from Ms. Shelley Ann Cox at that time. So today, our co-host, you see her full name there, but she goes by Rin. And she is from Laurel, Mississippi. She attends the Mississippi School for Math and Science, where she's a junior. Her favorite subject is biology, and she plans to major in biology in college. And work in the health field is one of her aspirations, healthcare field. She's involved with a number of different extracurricular activities and clubs. For example, the Way, a faith-based club, the Humanities Club, the Plant Club, the Asian Student Club. She's in the choir and she plays soccer. So it's a privilege to have Ren co-host with us here today. So at this time, Ren, it's your turn to introduce our speaker.
Dr. Morris C. Johnson is a research fire ecologist at the U.S. Forest Service, Pacific Northwest Research Station, Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Laboratory located in Seattle, Washington. He grew up in a small northeastern Louisiana town called Waterproof, Louisiana. He was a member of both the Redmond, which is in Redmond, Oregon, and Redding, which is in Redding, California, and terror agency Hotshot crew. He earned a bachelor's degree in urban forestry from Southern University, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a master's degree in silviculture and forest protection, and PhD degree in ecosystem analysis, fire ecology, both from the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington.
Okay. All right, so thank you for that. So I will stop sharing and there you go. Dr.
Hey.
Johnson.
So everyone can see my first slide, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Mhm.
Well, thanks, Ren, for the introduction. That was great, and thanks for the invite to for this to make my presentation. Okay, so I will start. Let's hope it works. Okay, so yeah, so yes, I am Morris Johnson. I'm a research fire scientist, research fire ecologist for the PNW Research Station in Seattle, Washington. And the title of my talk is Managing Forests and Wildfires in the Western United States. So, and I'm also a affiliate professor at the University of Washington at the School of Environmental and Fire Forest Sciences, also located in Seattle, Washington. So I've been working for the Forest Service for about, I think maybe 27 years. I started when I was an undergrad at Southern University. When I was in the urban forestry program. Now, I know everyone always asks me, how did I get to the Forest Service? And so, when I grew up in Louisiana, I graduated in a class of my high school classmates. We had 25 that graduated, and it was not emphasized to go to college. It was everyone, our main goal was, okay, you graduate, you get a job. And a lot of us, our plans were to go to the armed forces. So that was really my goal, was to go to the Marines. But one of my aunts basically told me, well, you should think about going to college. And so I applied to Southern University, went to Southern University, and my first semester at Southern University, I did not have a major. And so someone said, well, there's a new program in the back of college, and you should really think about urban forestry. So I signed up for urban forestry mainly because they were going to pay for college. It was not like I was in an environmental AP class in high school and I said, oh, yes, that is what I want to do in college. It was really because it was a new program. It was something new and exciting. But one of the most exciting things about the degree program was that you had to do summer internships. So my first summer internship was in Prospect, Oregon. And because, I came from a really poor family, we weren't able to afford for me to fly out to see Prospect. I actually had to take the Greyhound bus. It was 3 days out to Prospect, Oregon, and that was my first summer job. And so you fast forward a couple of years, I get converted over to a full-time employee. And then 2 years later, after I got converted over to a full-time employee, one of my professors at Southern University, he was bringing up some students to the University of Washington. And he said, you should come up and look at the graduate school because you should think about graduate school. And I said, Lewis, I don't need graduate school because I have a full-time job. Why would I go back to school when I have a full-time job? So he said, no, just come up and we're going to do the Space Needle. We're going to do all this Seattle touristy stuff. So that is what really convinced me to go up. I go up, I ran into Chad Oliver, and he said, anytime you thinking about going to graduate school, let me know, and then I will get you accepted. So I thought about that, and then I said, well, maybe I do want to go to graduate school. So I applied to graduate school, got into the University of Washington, and did my master's degree. And halfway through my master's degree, Chad asked me, well, are you thinking about going beyond your master's degree? And I said, oh no, Chad, I cannot do that, Chad, because I have lots of friends that are in the PhD program, and I see the stress that they go through. And he said, okay, just think about it. And then this was around the time Bill and Melinda Gates Fellowship came out. And so they nominated me for the Bill and Melinda Gates Fellowship. I received that. And so then obviously the decision was made that I'm going to go on to get my PhD. So long story short is, in waterproof, it was never my goal to go to college, really. It was, my goal was really to go to the Marines. But, just by going to urban forestry, going to a Southern University, that is what put me on my career path with the Foresters. And like I say, I think in December, I would have been with the Forest Service for 28 years. So,
Wow.
so yeah. I know I never thought I would be with one organization for so long. So, but it's a good job. So, so I work for the Pacific Northwest Research Station and the Forest Service. So that's we have five different research stations. So I'm up there, the Pacific Northwest. So I'm the pink. So we cover Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. You can see there's other research stations. Overall, within the Forest Service, if you're not familiar with the Forest Service, we have the National Forest Service systems. If you ever have gone to go camping, or if you know about Smokey the Bear, across the United States, we have different ranger districts. And so those are the National Forest Service offices. And so within the Forest Service, we have research and development. And within research and development, it's really, really, really small. We only have about 1,500 total employees. And then within the 1,500 employees, we only have about less than 450 research scientists. And so I'm one of those scientists. And those different scientists have different disciplines. So we have fire ecologists, wildlife biologists, but it's not very many of them scattered across these different research stations. And so I usually use these prompts to basically give an overview of some of my work projects. And so I use this block of wood basically to summarize or represent the national forest, right? And then I know everyone knows about Legos. And so the Legos in this case is going to represent we can just call it a city or a community, right? And then the box of matches, within the box of matches, obviously, there's matches inside, but those are going to represent what we consider if there's a wildfire, what would be within the forest that has the opportunity to burn? And so in this case, the matches are going to represent trees, right? And so one of my first projects that we looked at was basically trying to understand across the national forest, if there's a wildfire, what is going to be available within the forest to burn? And then how can we manage that? And when I say manage, where can we go into the forest to remove some of the trees and then do some prescribed burn to basically change the structure. And the structure is basically you remove some of the vegetation. So whenever there is a wildfire, when the fire comes through, we can change the way the fire behaves, or we can change the transition from a surface fire to a crown fire. And so we want to do this right here, like, this is the current national forest, because I won't go into the background about how we suppress wildfires and how that changed fire behavior, but we're trying to basically change that really within what we call the wildland urban interface. So those areas that are next to communities, you probably have seen it on the news when the wildfires burn from the national forest and then they burn within a community and they destroy lots of homes. You probably have seen it in California where wildfire comes through, burns lots of homes, it causes lots of mortality. And so what we're trying to do is say, okay, within the forest, how can we manipulate that forest structure? So whenever the wildfire comes, we can basically manipulate we can change the fire behavior. Because remember, we cannot prevent a wildfire from happening. We can only manage the fire behavior, because I know a lot of people think, doing the field, what we call field treatments or manipulation, that would prevent wildfires. That is not the case. We can manage the forest structure so we can control the way the fire burns across the landscape, because we really want the fire to actually burn, because historically, these systems, when I say systems, these forest types, they were maintained by these wildfires. And so what has happened in the last 50, 60 years is that we have removed fire. When I say removed fire, anytime there was a fire start, we suppressed the fire, right? We put these small fires out, and every time we suppress a wildfire, we remove that disturbance, and that disturbance basically maintained that forest structure. So now there's not, that disturbance is not out there maintaining the structure. So we have an accumulation of vegetation. And so whenever that wildfire does come, it becomes a large destructive wildfire.
Mhm.
So, and so then the second part of my research is basically looking at, okay, so after we've had a large wildfire to come through, now we have a landscape, because we've suppressed a lot of wildfires, we have a lot of trees. Now we have a landscape with a lot of dead trees, right? And so now the question is, how do we manage the dead trees? Do we leave the dead trees, or do we remove the dead trees and then we replant? Because overall, we want to have a healthy green forest. And so the question is, do we plant within the dead trees, or do we remove them first? I know it sounds like a ridiculous question, but that is some of the issues that we have in the environmental community, in terms of, should we remove the dead trees and plant, or should we not do anything? So those are some of the questions that we have. And so if you go back to like basic biology, everyone knows about, probably, well, I'm assuming everyone knows about the fire behavior triangle and the fuels triangle. And so in order to have a fire or combustion, you'll learn this, or you will learn this in physics, you need to have, these elements to have a fire. And that is fuel, heat, and oxygen, right? So if you remove one of those, you would not have a fire or a combustion. And in the fire behavior world, we have a fire behavior triangle. So fuels, topography, and weather, those three elements that controls wildfire behavior. So if the slope is steep and you have a wildfire, you're going to have the fire to move across the landscape faster. If the relative humidity is low and the temperature is high and the wind speeds are high, all of those in combination would basically affect fire behavior. So in order to manipulate, the fire behavior and the start of a wildfire, the only thing that we can actually control on these triangles are fuels. And fuels in this case, what we're talking about, I know I try to get away from these jargon terms, but fuels is basically anything within a forest that is available to burn. And so in a forest, if you ever have gone to a forest, we're talking about everything from the surface all the way to the top of the trees. So we're talking about standing trees, live trees, dead trees. And then as you go from the trees down to the ground, we're talking about the shrubs and herbaceous materials. And then you go from the shrubs down to the ground. If you lay on the ground, there's dead woody fuels, we call it 1 hour, 10 hour, 100-hour fuels. There's litter, there's duff, there's all these things that are available to burn when the wildfire comes through. And the moisture that's contained within these different elements basically contribute to fire behavior. And so the fuels within a stand is what we can manipulate. And so, like I said, historically, we had a lot of wildfires in some of these dry forest types that basically used to come through every, let's say, 10 years. And they used to maintain that forest structure to make sure that there was an accumulation of vegetation. And with fire suppression, a lot of understory trees, I call them baby trees, used to come in, and then they change that forest structure. So now, whenever there's a wildfire, that wildfire basically transitions to what we would consider a crown fire. So instead of being a surface fire that only consumed the shrubs and the non-woody vegetation, and then some small seedlings and saplings, now what is happening is that the accumulation of all that vegetation is transitioning to a surface fire. And so we can model a lot of this fire behavior stuff with models. And so with some of the models, forest vegetation simulator, I will mention this later. So historically, what it looked like is with that repeated wildfire, what we talk about in terms of the forest structure, the canopy, what we call the canopy base height. Here, the canopy base height was high. So in order for a surface fire to transition to a crown fire, it's going to be harder, right? Because that canopy base height is so high. But with fire suppression, you have this accumulation of a lot of vegetation. And so now what we have is that canopy base height is lower. So whenever a wildfire comes in, it's easier for that fire to come in and transition to a crown fire. And then, some of the other measurements that we look at is basically, what we call canopy bulk density. And then that basically contribute to fire behavior. Hold on one second. Hey, I'm presenting, please. Okay, so when we're trying to manage that forest structure, we're really talking about thinning or managing the forest from below. So in this stand, when we say manage forest structure, we're talking about going in and removing some of the smaller trees. So we want to remove these trees in the understory. So we call this thinning from below. So if you look at the diameter distribution of a stand, we're only removing those, what we call, trees that are 0 to 8 inches, 0 to 12 inches. And then sometimes we have to get some of the bigger trees, but we're really thinking about, if you think about a stand on a conveyor belt of fire, and you move that stand through that fire, if you have a dead stand, obviously everything is going to burn. But if you remove that ladder fuel, then you basically can change the way the fire burns through that stand. So this is, without getting into all the jargon, this is basically thinning from below or managing fuels from below. And so we can, like I say, we can visualize, which is the best or the most appropriate prescription or thinning prescription that we can use in order to meet our management objectives. Because obviously, the most, one way we can change the fire behavior, right, is if we take all the trees, right? But we're not allowed to do that. And it's because we have to manage for multiple management objectives, because we have to, we have to manage for wildlife habitat, we have to manage for, soils and water benefits, and we also have to manage for fire behavior. And so one of the things we can do is we can say, okay, well, what would happen to fire behavior or the other resources if we go in and we do this, what we call this gaming. So if we start off with a stand that has a lot of trees per acre, what happens if we remove X number of trees? So if we leave X number of trees, if we leave 50 trees per acre, 100, 200, 300, and then we can basically compare which of these treatments are going to help us meet our management objectives. And so I know this was back in 2011 where I basically downloaded probably 50,000 stands from across the West, and I basically did this gaming with Forest Vegetation Simulator. And remember, like I said, this is just a model. So I went in and basically said, okay, I want to figure out which is the best treatment to change fire behavior. And so the model, like I said, this is just a computer simulation model, would tell me which is the best treatment to change fire behavior. And this stuff over here is basically telling us that thinning down to 50 trees per acre is the most effective for changing fire behavior. And this is basically looking at what we call the torching index, or in other words, it's just for this case, the torching index is basically changing fire behavior. But remember, this is a computer model. This is not the real world. And so this is mostly used as a guide to develop treatments. And so really what I've done is after we model what is the best treatment, the only way to know if the model is somewhat correct or somewhat correct and guiding us down the right path is we basically say, okay, well, we need to know what happens in the real world. And so what I do is basically whenever there's a large wildfire, I can track the large wildfires. You can track the large wildfires every summer also on this website. And this website will basically tell you every summer where the large wildfires are across the West. So I would basically go through and find the largest wildfires, and then I would call the National Forest Service system managers and say, hey, did that wildfire burn through any recent fuel treatments? And if they tell me yes, then I would go out and then I would say, okay, I want to see if the thinning treatments were effective at changing fire behavior. And so this is a 2011 wildfire in Apache Six Grace National Forest, which is in Arizona. And so what you can see is above this yellow line, this is untreated, right? So this is the matches with the dense stand. And then below the yellow line, this is where they actually implemented the thinning treatments. And they implemented the thinning treatments based on those guidelines that we created. So they thinned from below and they removed the fuels and they did some prescribed burning. And then this red line represents the wildland urban interface. So that's the communities. And so the communities are where the houses are. And so this is a perfect example to say, okay, so when they implemented these treatments, they were assuming that if one day a wildfire burns, then this would protect that community. Just so happened this is another thinning unit. So 4 years after the thinning treatment, we had the 2011 wildfire. So the fire basically burned into the community. And so here is the fire progression map. So really the fire progression map, this big orange blob is the day the fire burned 50,000 acres, which is a lot. And it burned into that community. And so I would show you. So here is that unburned. This was above the yellow line. And then this is right at the transition where you had the unburned, untreated, and then it transitioned into the treated area. And then here is the wildland urban interface. And don't worry about that fire, this matrix. This is just us trying to calculate how long it took before the fire transitioned down to the ground. But the whole take-home message is what you can see is that here's the wildfire. You can see that as the fire transitioned from the untreated to the treated, that there was a change in fire behavior. And that's what all of this stuff over here is basically measuring. We can see that as the fire transitioned into the treated area, there was a change in fire behavior. So that's, and you don't need this right here to tell you that, because we can see it in the photo right here that there was a change in fire behavior. For us scientists, we have to actually quantify it, but the picture tells you everything. And so this is this is just other quantitative data to show you that as the fire transitioned from the untreated to the treated, there was a change in the fire behavior. And then this one out here tells another story, but I won't go into that. But really what happened was they modified the thinning prescription out here to accommodate wildlife habitat. And then obviously what it's basically telling us is if you leave more trees, it's just going to take longer before that fire behavior changes. And so then we go to, like I say, I call a lot of national forests when I see these large wildfires. So I called another national forest. Actually, this is the same national forest, but just 3 years later, and we basically measured we had the same setup where there was untreated and treated, and we basically found we calculated the same results. Untreated versus treated, we can see that as that wildfire is basically coming like a big train, right? From the untreated, as it hit that treated area, it basically drops down to the ground and then it burns as a surface fire. Now, immediately, it doesn't drop down as soon as it gets to the treatment boundary. It takes a couple meters, like 100 meters before it transitions down. But what we can see is that thinning treatments are effective at changing the fire behavior. And in this case, I'm talking about crown fire behavior. And so next we went over to California. This was actually the same year. So on the Lasser National Forest in California, and we basically measured the exact same thing. We found the wildfire that burnt into some treatments within the first 3 or 4 days. And we had the same design because we're trying to look at as the wildfire burns from the untreated into a treated area, are thinning treatments effective at changing fire behavior? And obviously we found the same results. But what we found here, because this is a different forest type, was that it took a considerable longer distance. This is like up to like 600 meters before there was a change in fire behavior. So overall, what we found is that thinning treatments, they are effective at changing fire behavior, but the size of the thinning treatments is probably the most important thing, especially when you are placing these thinning treatments around communities, because you can thin and remove all the trees, but if you have these smaller thinning treatments, those are not going to be effective at protecting communities. Because remember, we need the thinning treatments to be big enough not to protect the community, not only to protect the communities, they need to be big enough for firefighters to be in the communities in order to defend the houses, because we need the firefighters to be there to spray water and to extinguish spot fires, because as the fire is coming from the untreated, ahead of the main fire, there's going to be lots of fire brands that's going to land on houses. And so in order for firefighters to be there to put those out, you have to have pretty big thinning treatments. So that's what I would consider the introduction to managing green forests or forest structure to change fire behavior. So then I would basically make sure I don't go over my time. Yeah. So then after that, so like I said, that the next part of my talk is so after the wildfire, the next question is how do or where should we actually manage the post-fire environment? So after large wildfires, so for example, on the Mendocino National Forest in 2020, we had the August complex. The Mendocino National Forest is in California. And so the August complex basically burned over 1 million acres. So it burned the Mendocino National Forest, Shasta Trinity National Forest, and the Six Rivers National Forest. And if you look across that wildfire, you will see, just like this photo up here in the left or in the right, across these wildfires, you will see this mosaic. When I say mosaic, there's these patches of live trees and dead trees, but there are really some big patches of dead trees. And so the question is, what do we do with these dead trees? Should we remove them, or should we leave them on the landscape? And so one of my projects is really trying to understand that. So if we start off with a forest that looks like this, and most of the trees are dead, and we know over time, dead trees are going to, standing dead trees or snags are not going to stay standing for very long. They're going to end up on the ground. And so we start off with a dead forest, but we also have a set of management objectives, right? So obviously, if some of the dead trees had economic value, we would like to capture some of that. So that means we go in and do some salvage logging, right? Now, if the dead trees do not have an economic value, we still have some management objectives. For example, we would like to reduce future fuel loading because we want to reduce future fire behavior. Because like I say, standing dead trees are not going to stand for very long. It's going to end up on the ground. And then when it ends up on the ground, that's going to increase fuel loading. And we talked about the fire behavior triangles. Increasing fuel loading is going to potentially increase fire behavior in the future. So what I end up doing is working with managers to basically try to understand what would happen if you manage the forest, and what happens if you do not manage the forest. And so we say, okay, well, if you have this stand with all these dead trees and you simulate over time what's going to happen, and if you have a future wildfire, we try to basically show them the consequences of doing active management versus passive management, because we want to show them, well, if you don't do anything, and if you have a repeat wildfire, this is going to be the consequences. And that's what this figure here is basically showing, is if you actually leave the fuels or the stand unmanaged, this model is basically showing that depending on how many snags are standing, this is showing us the accumulation over time. This is, once again, this is just a model, the accumulation of woody fuel that's going to be on the ground in the future. And then we have a fire combustion model that's going to tell us if there's a wildfire, this is going to be the soil heating, and soil heating transitions into other environmental effects in terms of you can end up causing a lot of detrimental effects to the soils that it would take many years in order to recover. And so, like I said, once again, we start off initially with models, right? So we have this model that says, okay, over time, this is what we think the loading is going to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then once that fuel is on the ground, we want to know, we say, if there's a wildfire, this is going to be the consequence. So that is the modeling part. But then what like I said, what I want to do is I want to actually collect quantitative data. So I work with the managers, and if they decide that, yes, we are going to actively manage an area that has burned, then I basically work with them to set up what I call post-fire monitoring research project, to basically compare what happens if you have a dead forest, what happens if you do nothing versus active management. And so really what I would do is I set up a randomized block design. So we would identify an area that we want to do this active management or salvage logging. Then I would set up this randomized block design. So each of these, what you can see, each of these cut units is a block. And then each cut unit is 5.4 acres. And then each 5.4 acres has 24 fixed area plots. And so basically in all of these things, we measure standing vegetation and the dead snags, and then the stuff that's on the ground before they do the active management. So when I left off, I basically said that I work with the managers and we set up this randomized block design to basically compare what happens if you do active management versus no action. And so let's see. So I work with what we consider the IDT team. And so if we go through this NEPA process, it takes us eight to 9 months to go through this NEPA process. And so this is when I have the opportunity to set up. So we essentially, we set up that randomized block design working with the managers. And the idea is we set it up before they do the salvage logging, and then if they actually do the salvage logging, then we go back in and then we remeasure the control units and the treated areas, and then we can compare what happens before the salvage logging and then after the salvage logging. Now, because I'm working with the National Forest Service systems and we have to go through the NEPA process, a lot of times our treatments are not implemented. And so then what we end up doing is we go back to the modeling, and then this is where we end up modeling the treatment effect. So we can simulate in FES what would happen if we had done the full salvage or the intermediate salvage or no salvage at all. And we can look at fuel loadings, how fuel loading is going to change over time. Because in the fire behavior world, fuel loading equates to fire behavior. And so the more fuel loading you have, then they assume that if the fuel loading increases and there's a repeat wildfire, because we know there's going to be a repeat wildfire, especially like in California, like on the Plumas National Forest, within the last 10 years, some of those areas have reburned 3 or 4 times. And so what we're basically trying to show them is across the landscape, these areas that have this initial standing basal area or trees per hectare, if you leave these areas untreated, this is what we think the loading is going to be over time. And so we can basically simulate, like I say, the fire behavior. And so that's why I say we were real close, because that's like the end of the presentation.
All right. Okay, so Rin, you want to jump in here, Rin? We're not hearing you.
She's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So the first question I have is, what are the effects on the ecosystem when you're like thinning the area?
So it depends on what we're looking at. Sometimes when we thin the area, depending on how many trees we remove, we can have an increase in soil heating, right? Because if you think about a stand that was dense, and now we are removing some of those trees, you have this increase in sunlight now, right? So that area can actually increase. We have more sunlight, and so that is the argument. Some people say, well, if you remove those trees, you make the surface drier because there's an increase in sunlight and soil and surface heating. But that is okay, because really what you're doing is you're removing that vegetation that actually can contribute to fire behavior. The other thing that actually happens to the ecosystem is you have what we call, you have a increase in the available growing space. So before everything, if you think about a dense forest, you remove that understory vegetation. And so now there's an opportunity for those suppressed vegetation to start growing. So we have an influx of shrubs and non-woody vegetation. That is good for wildlife habitat. Fire people say, well, that's bad, because now they want to come in and burn that. So it all depends on what, if you're the wildlife biologist or the fire person, these response to the thinning, is that's good or bad. So it's always this push and pull, because if you do not remove the small trees and there's a wildfire, then you lose the stand, right? So that's why we try to go in and say, okay, we have to find this balance between how many trees or the matches can we remove, and not to make sure we don't have a negative consequence on other resources.
The next question that I have is, when do you think that thinning treatment will be used in majority of the air, like forests in the United States?
That's a good question. Well, the thinning treatments, they need to be implemented now. If you, I don't know how many acres we have, but there's probably 200,000-300,000. 200 million acres that probably need to be treated with thinning treatments. So the backlog that we have is way out there. So yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a lot of acres that need to be treated. But see, the problem is, let's say if you were a district ranger on the Deschutes National Forest, right? And you wanted to treat 25,000 acres.
Mhm.
That's a nice chunk of forest. But in order to do that, you're going to have to go through the NEPA process. And to treat 25,000 acres, you're going to have to do like the second stage of the environmental assessment. So EA takes 2 years to get completed. But now, because there may be a significant environmental impact, you got to do an EIS. So that can take 6 years maybe to
Wow.
get done. Yeah.
Wow.
So in order to implement a treatment on the landscape, that basically the paperwork that's required, it hinders you from doing it.
Mhm.
So you can plan the perfect treatment. You say, oh yes, I want to do this treatment. I'm going to do A, B, C, and D because it's going to protect this community. The community can be behind you, but we still have to go through the NEPA process. And the NEPA process is basically saying all the specialists need to go out to analyze to make sure the treatment that you're going to do is not going to have a negative environmental impact. Basically, that question, your first question that you ask, they have all the specialists, they want to basically analyze your first question. What are the effects that if the civil culture people, the fire people do these treatments, what's going to be the effects to my resources? So the soils people, the hydrology, hydrogen, all of those people, they want to know, okay, if REN does these treatments, how is that going to affect my resource area? And they can't do that overnight.
Mhm. Yeah. Pat, do you have questions as well?
I didn't have time to properly prepare for this, unfortunately.
It's okay.
But these are huge areas, and I mean the forested areas that I'm more familiar with are in Scotland and in Trinidad. In Scotland, of course, they planted a whole pile of fir trees, and in between when they plant them, and it's really plantation, it's really like tree farming rather than what you're doing. And what they have is these fire traces, which they maintain these fire traces so that they can contain a fire. And so you're thinning, etc., and the way you treat it is kind of like a continuous sort of undergrowth fire trace. Is that my understanding?
Yes. So initially, if we do a thinning to a forest, so that's the initial treatment. And so we go in with the chainsaws, remove the small trees, and then within 4 or 5 years, we want to maintain that treatment. We want to maintain that condition. So we follow up those treatments with prescribed fire. So now we're in the maintenance phase, right? So we can hopefully maintain that forest structure with prescribed fire. So it's basically you dig, you have a control line around this area, and then you periodically go in and you use prescribed fire to maintain that shrub response to, and that response from small trees regenerating. And so now, and ideally you don't have to come back in and treat those areas with the chainsaw. But the initial treatment for a lot of forests, dry forests, is you have to use the chainsaw because these forests have a lot of trees per acre across the landscape.
Mhm. So I was wondering, in your models, did you take into consideration the type of tree?
My question. Good.
Okay. Because some trees my understanding, just from sort of like chemical composition beyond the cellulose and stuff, could be more flammable, to put it mildly. The shape of the tree. So I'm thinking like pine trees versus, I don't know, other type
Oak.
of trees.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
is that a factor, or is your thinning process one that the tree type is irrelevant to?
No, in the models, they do distinguish between conifer versus deciduous trees,
Okay.
because that's going to affect basically one of those slides I was showing you, the canopy bulk density. So
Mhm.
that's going to affect the calculating the amount of mass that's going to be available to burn. It's really general, but it does look at the forest structure, or the canopy structure of the stand in terms of its contribution to fire behavior, but not at the cellulose level like you're talking.
Yeah.
It's more about
Yeah.
it's the architect of the
Of the
stand.
tree.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
because we're trying to calculate if a fire starts in a stand. So as the fire is burning, and we think about the flame height, right? As a
Mhm.
fire is burning on the ground, and as the fire comes and the flame height is 2 feet, right?
Mhm.
3 feet. And then, but if the canopy base height of the stand is 1 foot, then we're just basically saying, okay, if it's 3 feet here and 2 feet here, then that's the combination where we can have a transition to a crown fire. Because we think about the fire types, we have a surface fire and a crown fire. Those are
Right.
and so we're trying to prevent a crown fire from happening. Because
Well,
once it becomes a crown fire, then it
that
basically,
goes wild.
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
So another factor would be, like, would your model recommend the type of spacing that's necessary between the trees?
Yes, so that's what I was trying to show, but I was trying to not go into all the details
Okay.
about showing when I was talking about the 50, the 100, the 200, 300 trees
Right.
per acre.
Per acre. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, that's based on spacing. So if you
Okay.
go in and say, if it Desmond, if you stand over here and I stand over here, if we stand 8 foot apart, or if you stand 12 foot apart, that basically equates to a thinning prescription of thin down to 50 trees per acre or 100 trees per acre. So
Okay.
it's a spacing. But
Okay.
now what we're trying to get away from this straight spacing prescription, because once you start doing a spacing prescription, you end up with what Pat talked about. You end up with a plantation, right? Because everything is 8 by 8 spacing, or 12 by 12. So it's all homogeneous. So now what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically, you think about a piece of Swiss cheese. That's prescription that we're going for. So you take the Swiss cheese, you lay it on the landscape, and all the holes in the Swiss cheese, that's where you want to remove those trees.
Okay.
And so you make this homogeneous pattern across the landscape. Because historically, if you look at some of the historical maps and historical photos, that was the mosaic across the landscape. It wasn't these homogeneous. It was dead patches here, live trees here, big trees here. Because when the fire came through, that's what it actually looked like. You think about for Christmas, when someone buys you that 500-piece puzzle, that's what the landscape looked like, right? So you
Okay.
have all of these patches across the landscape, and each piece of the puzzle represent a wildfire that happened 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Okay.
So all of those different pieces, it's a different stand structure or a different disturbance year. So now when you have a modern wildfire that come and burn, it would basically burn and hit this piece and hit that piece and hit this piece. But now what the landscape looks like is the puzzle piece, the puzzle set when you get to a 3-year-old, right? Because that puzzle set is only like 5 pieces. It's these big pieces. So now it's all homogeneous. So you have these large, big patches of homogeneous stand structure. So when a wildfire starts, you have these large wildfires.
Okay, so you try to avoid a homogeneous pattern,
Yes.
yeah, type, okay.
Yeah.
So another factor, another factor is from one place to the next, you have different wind speeds.
Yep.
So that's also in your model?
That's in the model. Yep. So
Okay.
so in the forest vegetation, the fire and fields extension to the forest vegetation simulator, we can we measure the forest structure. So that's the trees per acre, this DBH and the height and the species, and then we can simulate, and we can simulate uh, fire behavior by saying, okay, this is the wind speed. Like that fire behavior triangle. If we crank up the wind speed, then the fire behavior is going to increase. If you tinkle with the fuel moisture, the fuel, the 1 hour, the 10 hour, 100 hour, the moisture that's in the fuel, that messes with the fire behavior some. In the real world, it definitely messes with the fire behavior, right? So if the fuel moisture is low, then you have a higher chance of fire ignition. But the biggest thing that actually changes fire behavior is the wind speed and the slopes. So if the fire is burning on flat ground, obviously it would burn, but it burns hotter and faster if it's on a slope, especially
Right.
going uphill.
Right.
So we try to avoid putting field treatments on steep slopes.
Oh, okay.
Because
Okay.
if you put a field treatment on a slope that's 40-50% like this, it's not going to be effective, because as this fire is burning, it has a higher probability of preheating the fuel head, and so it's not gonna be effective field treatment.
So it's kind of striking me that in order to, I didn't understand, I didn't know, I didn't realize that to be in your field, in the Forest Service, that you need some degree of math. Like these are complex, these are like complex factors you have to take into consideration, and it would result in some crazy mathematical equations.
Yes, yeah. Well, for the work that I do, because we're trying to we want to try to calculate the distance from the treatment boundary, a quantitative difference distance, to see how big a treatment needs to be, and so our measure of our measure of response is a change in burn severity, and so that's why we
Right.
came up with that Weibull curve, that distribution. So yeah, so we do, and
Yeah.
we in order to compare the difference with the randomized block design, we have to use a lot of the statistical models.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like it, it really does. Wow. So one of the things that also struck me is the word buffer. It looks like what you're doing in the treated is to create a buffer between, the fire and the community.
Yes.
And what I'm learning now is that that buffer is something that is specific to each case because of all these different factors that you have to take into consideration. For some, the buffer would be wider, others less so, and so on. Is that correct?
Well, we want it to be as wide as possible. Because remember, even the buffers that I showed in my example, that is not wide enough to protect the community by itself. Because remember, sometimes a wildfire burning across the landscape, it can throw firebrands. So firebrands is that are burning up to a half a mile or 2 miles ahead of the fire.
Whoa, 2 miles? Wow.
Yes. So yeah, so because you
Wow.
think about, you have a fire column that's burning,
Yeah.
and then inside the fire is creating its own weather. And so
Yeah.
it's generating its own weather. And so firebrands get sucked up in the convection column, and it can be a couple miles ahead of the fire.
Wow.
So like I said, it's all about just having a wide enough buffer so firefighters can protect the homes in the community, because Because remember, as the fire is coming into communities, a lot of these houses are getting showered with firebrands. And
Mm,
so the firefighters need to be there to basically to extinguish that.
yeah, yeah.
So
Sheldon, you have a question? Comment?
Yeah, yeah, I have a question. Um, so I came on kind of late. I wanted to find out your work. How does different state to state rule affect your work? Like the rules in different state. I'm not sure if you work with the federal government or not, but
Mhm.
does the rules in different state affect what you are doing?
Hmm.
when you say what type of rules?
Like you were talking about creating these buffers and stuff for communities.
Oh, yeah, no, those rules, they don't change because see, I work with all national forests. So I work for the Forest Service, but I work in research and development. So I work with all the different national forests. So my domain, my real domain is really the 11 Western states. So if there's a wildfire in any of those 11 Western states, I can potentially be working on one of those fires. But
Mhm.
it just so happened the last 5 years, I spent a lot of time in California
Mm, mm,
and
mm.
Oregon and Washington and uh and well, yeah, those are the main three states because
Those are the main.
they have fire every year, especially
Mhm.
California.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
But I've been out, I've been, well, in my example, I've been to Arizona. I didn't show Idaho, but Idaho and I think, yeah, Idaho.
Mm,
All the other places I haven't. They've had some fires. They weren't very big.
mhm.
They didn't do what I thought they was going to do, so I never had the opportunity. But like I say, every summer, I'm just waiting.
Yeah. So we're gonna end pretty soon here, but I wanted to kind of circle back to Michigan because I saw on your map there is at least one research station and one national forest. I actually went through just driving and stuff. That national forest is pretty impressive and really actually beautiful too. It was mostly pine trees.
Mhm.
Um, so the Forest Service has um, these research labs and stations across the country, almost in every state. Is that correct?
No, not almost in every state. So I had to look at the map again. It's not in because out in the east, there's a couple research stations, but they cover a lot of the states.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because
Okay.
in Washington, we have, I mean, Pacific Northwest Research Station, we cover Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, and the Pacific Southwest Research Station covers California and the Pacific Islands, and
Mhm.
then the Rocky Mountains covers I think Idaho, Montana. I can't remember. I have to look at the
Okay.
map.
Okay. Yeah, I saw one in Michigan, so I thought that was pretty interesting. All right. Well, I want to go ahead and thank you, Dr. Johnson. I want to also thank our co-host, Rin, for short. Um, I don't know if she is going to consider or work Forest Service. I know she wants to get into healthcare, but wanted to really thank you both. And for those who persisted even through our little trial here on the Zoom call. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Sheldon, for coming in. And we look forward to hearing more from you, seeing more of your work out there in the Pacific Northwest. Is that right? Pacific
Yes.
Northwest?
Yep, that's
Um,
it.
Trying to help our community. And our brand is Environmental Fridays. It is personal, and this is definitely personal when a big fire is coming down into your community. So thank you so very much. Pat,
Does-
Pat, you had
does-
something to say too?
Yeah, I would just like to put in a little plug for one of the NGOs that are involved with Council of Presidents of the Environment. And they are actually, it's the Fonsamans Community Reforestation Project. And they are actually putting together a forest fire policy. And this is coming from the NGO, from the ground, rather than from, so it's a bottom up rather than a top down. And I think they're having some assistance from some branch of the US Forestry Service.
So this is the US NGO?
I don't know, I'm not quite sure
Okay.
what it is,
Okay.
but what you're doing is it's fire prevention. What people on the ground are interested in is really dealing with the fire well, you're preventing fires from forming or slowing them down, whereas
Well-
they are trying to find some way of monitoring and firefighting on the ground, I suppose. It's just, I thought you would be interested that we have an NGO that is actually trying to put together a forest fire policy. And I thought that that could be of interest.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, you could send me whatever contact information with that NGO. And I could pass it on to Dr. Johnson. All right, well,
Thank you.
okay, thanks. We have come to the end of this episode. It was not a straightforward episode by any means, but we survived.
It was exciting.
It was exciting, for sure. So anyway, man, it's good connecting with you, and thank you so very much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your experience with all of us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rick. Okay,
thank you.
have a great day. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
For more information about our sponsors and partners, please visit the Environmental Fridays Partners and Sponsors page. Be sure to visit our website at www.theenvironmentalfridays.com.